First of all, welcome all. Now, Electronic Arts, EA Games, Inclusive Design and Product Development Director Tülay McNally will talk about the approach for more diversity and inclusion in their games and services. Now I will invite her to join us.
Hello.
Hello, welcome again. You can start when you're ready with your presentation. I'll be here if you need any help.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'll just start my presentation here. As mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk about something called the inclusion framework. And because it's a small group, so if there's any questions that you need me to slow down or something, please do raise, I can see you, don't raise your hand, but add it in the Q&A. I have prepared maybe a 15-20 minute talk. I want to show a few videos at the end as well. But I thought we can maybe have a good Q&A discussion. So I'm happy to just like work through any questions that you may have. So about who I am, I have to apologize that this talk is in English, but even when I speak to Germans, I have to talk about work in English because I talk about work in English 100% of the time, so it's really difficult for me to speak about work in a different language. My name is Tülay McNally. So I'm actually born to Turkish parents. They are from Izmir and Istanbul. But I was born and raised in Munich, Germany, back in the 70s. And I have graduated from the University of Munich in American Studies and a master's degree in American Studies and a bachelor's degree in psychology. And first I started working as a journalist, and then in 2006, I started working in video games. So I've been in the video games industry for 15 years. And I started out in Montreal as a localization tester and customer experience support for Pro Evolution Soccer 6. And I also did some translations when I worked at Square Enix in the UK, and I also worked for Sega in the UK, driving or running the America shift for Sega games like Bayonetta, actually, and Alpha Protocol was a good one, and a few others. And 2010, I joined EA. I moved back to Canada, and I spent about 8 years in Edmonton with a company called BioWare. They do fantasy RPGs like Dragon Age, Mass Effect, Knights of the Old Republic, Star Wars The Old Republic online game in Austin. And I was heading up first the QA teams, and then I started running what we call central development operations. So all the development support teams, including QA, quality assurance, quality engineering, release management, and so on, across Montreal, Austin, and Edmonton. Then my husband moved to Sweden for a job, and because he's from Scotland, we moved back to Sweden 3 years ago, and I started working at DICE as a senior development director, primarily on the studio side. And but I got the chance to work on Star Wars Battlefront 2 a little bit, and Battlefield 5, the Pacific, and I'll talk about that later on. So fast forward, today I'm in a brand new position that was created. I don't want to say it was created for me, but in a way it was created for me to really drive inclusion and diversity in our games across EA. And that means representation, but also making our games playable, both from an accessibility point of view, but also skill levels, so essentially removing all the barriers that exist within our games. And my job is to work with many different groups across all of EA to remove them. And essentially now I'm working on all EA titles, ranging from Apex Legends to The Sims to Dragon Age to Battlefield, you name it, which is really cool, and FIFA, obviously. So that's a bit of my background. And the Scottish is because my husband is Scottish, so the McNally comes from that. So first, before I go into the details of what the inclusion framework is and why we care about it, I wanted to show a bit of data, what really made us take action at EA. We did an internal study, which I think I'm linking to this in the next slide. One of our researchers did a study in 2018 about trying to find a link between toxicity in games and inclusion. And by toxicity or disruptive behavior, we are defining things like people who are cheating, people who are being racist in games. So whether that's by speech or text, chat, or by symbols, especially games like Battlefield, unfortunately, are quite toxic when it comes to the player community. So people feel like they can't really be themselves or engage, or females, for example, don't feel comfortable to show they are female, especially if they have to speak. We are trying to find ways to give people options. The research also found out that 45% of our players would actually play a game if the game had more inclusive features. But if we do this, players really want that the content and the stories we're telling, the characters we are portraying, are authentic and meaningful, and they are not falling back into stereotypes. So by stereotypes, for example, we mean that the woman always needs to be rescued. The Black guy always dies first, or is like very strong, and but we have like different kinds of people, different genders, different body sizes. So not everyone is like fit and muscular, but we have some people who are very thin or just like look a bit more like me in the game as well. And so essentially this meant that the majority of players want to play without disruptive behavior stopping them, and they want to feel they are represented and seen in the game. Then here's the link that I mentioned from Jenny Shi. She wrote a really great article, and you can find a bit more details on the study and the research. There's also a data platform called New Zoo. If you're not familiar, it's really cool. There's also a free trial if you want to try it out, but they also have some free reports you can pull. And New Zoo did a study which was published last November 2020, I think, which really showed and confirmed our study and research from 2018, which said that the gamer sentiment, so they were surveying people in the US, in the UK, that the gamer sentiment on diversity and inclusion really showed that, especially the US games market, which is still one of our biggest, is very diverse indeed when it comes to gender, ethnicity, sexual identity, etc. So from a demographics point of view, 45% of US gamers are women, 30% have a disability, and disability can come in any shape or form. So that can be visual impairment, it can be, we also count disability as you have a broken arm, so you can only play with one hand. What do you do? Or hearing impairment, for example, or color blindness and so on. 33% of US gamers are either Black, Asian, or Hispanic, and these are just the main categories they looked at, and 13% identify as LGBTQ+. And the result was really, again, players want to see more diversity reflected in the games, with more than 50% saying that diverse characters are important. I'll say a bit more about this. There's diverse characters that are sometimes in the background or supportive, but I assume some of you are players yourselves. There are not a lot of diverse characters you can play, so who are the main protagonist or the main character. And we are working on this. Right now it's mostly female main protagonist, but even there is not a lot. But again, inclusion and diversity is also about giving people the option, which can be, for example, through a character creator, or like Assassin's Creed did in Odyssey, giving you an option to play as a female or as a male right from the get-go. What this also means is that publishers like EA could potentially miss out on an opportunity by just engaging and reaching a much larger player audience. And because they might feel that the game is not really meant for them, so they are not playing it. But also from a social responsibility point of view, a lot of US gamers want that developers take an active stance to societal issues in the world. And that is also a bit of a generational thing. A lot of Gen Z are really keen for developers just to take a more harder stance on those societal issues. So inclusion, sorry, I forgot, go back. On the business side, it's always good to have data in the back pocket, but also just to summarize, especially as you are trying to convince people on your team or people who are in a decision-making position why this is important and why to invest in it. So in summary, inclusive design is important for the business, because by having more representation and diversity, you can expand to more emerging markets. By emerging markets, we mean countries like Brazil, Africa, India, and also Turkey. You can reach more players because more players will be able to play your game if you look at it from an accessibility point of view. But it also can improve your brand value, your brand recognition, and just create higher brand loyalty. So people just say, for example, EA makes games that align with what I care about and my value system. So that can create more players to check out maybe other games that they hadn't considered before, or continue playing your games, or just like having more player retention and also new player acquisition. But just like our players, employees also care about this topic a lot. So we are making a conscious effort to improve the diversity in talent on our teams. So having the obvious one, more female employees in the company. But also when you look at the creative makeup of the teams who are building these experiences, in the creative leadership, there's not a lot of diversity. It's often still white men who are making these games and tell stories about different cultures, which is okay. But obviously, if you have more diversity in talent, more diversity in thought as well, it can lead to new ideas, different perspectives, innovation, creativity in your product. And also more of our employees really also think the company should make a stance when it comes to things like society, the environment, and so on. And I also think from a quality perspective for our players, it improves the value proposition to play a game. I think there's more value for the time and money someone is spending in the game. And with the investment in people like myself and my team, the company, I see this also as a visible stance that we want to support our developers to achieve a more consistent and deliberate effort in inclusion and diversity. So it becomes something that we want to do. And by supporting the teams over time and creating the support structures which are part of the inclusion framework, we hope it at some point just becomes part of how we make games. The subject is normalized, it just becomes part of our DNA. And we don't in the future need a framework, but I also believe that kind of cultural change will take some time and probably a few years to become normalized. So I talked a lot about inclusive design. So what does that actually mean, or what do I mean by that? I know there's a term called inclusion design. Inclusion design, at least from what I've seen and what I think, is often focused on usability and accessibility, but by inclusive design, we really mean the broader spectrum of this game is made for everyone, and not just focusing on something like accessibility features or disability focus. So as we approach it, we see it as a method or a philosophy of designing to engage as diverse or as many people as possible in an authentic way with all of our products and services. And by services, we mean also our platforms such as Origin, for example. This topic also, inclusive design, considers cultural and societal needs. And it also complies with things like legal accessibility codes, the content itself, clear language, and non-exclusive language as well. Inclusive design is also about engaging or building games and content for a very diverse range. For example, how gender, age, sexuality, ethnicity, different socioeconomic backgrounds, culture, customs, language, body shapes and sizes, religious beliefs shape the way we interact with the world and with our games. And more importantly, it's about really building those products with that understanding in mind. And on the left-hand side, you essentially see what we call our diversity dimensions or diversity lenses. So when we are reviewing a game or a piece of content, we are looking at it from all of those different angles. So someone sends us, for example, a concept art or an image and says, is this culturally okay or offensive? We would ask questions such as, what are we reviewing here? Who are we building this content for? What's the background story of that character? I had one example where someone sent me a picture and I was asking questions like, I can't tell you if it's offensive to give this character a specific ethnicity if I don't know the background story, like what's their cultural upbringing, who's their father, where were they born, what are they doing, and all of those things essentially show the iceberg or diversity iceberg as well, because there's some things that you just see with your eye, with the obvious ones, like the color of your skin, your race, your gender, your age. But the topic of inclusion and diversity is a lot more complex, because for me to say that something is authentic, believable, respectful, you also have to consider a lot of these what we call intersectionalities that make something more authentic and believable. So I can have a woman, but really what's the heritage? What languages do they speak? Is the language they speak inclusive? When you have a character with a voiceover, for example, even the delivery of the voiceover is sometimes sounds stereotypical. If you've seen a dreadful film called Star Wars Episode 1, the Jar Jar Binks, for example, he was called out for having essentially using slave language as a accent. So we are looking at all of those aspects as well to make sure that it is not perceived as a stereotype in the end. I'll pause here for a second. Are there any questions before I continue?
We don't have any questions yet, but I would like to ask you something regarding the LGBTQI plus situation. So when some game companies add LGBTQI plus characters in their games, some of them are regarded as a forced characterization. Like some game communities says it's a bit forced to add this character to the game. How do you manage around this problem?
Yeah.
Making that character more natural as possible. How do you do that?
Yeah, I think one way to approach it is really not to emphasize the sexuality of the character, because ultimately, like if I meet someone, you are just a person to me. Like you don't need to lead with your sexuality. I don't lead with my gender. I don't lead with my ethnicity, for example. And I think by leading with your sexuality and making it too obvious, it can be perceived as you are just doing this to prove a point in a way. So we have been discussing this for a product recently as well, where we said, should we make it obvious? And we said, well, it's really up to the player and their fantasy, like what they want to make the player. I know I have worked on games like Dragon Age, for example, but I think an RPG in that context is a bit different because we're really telling stories from multiple angles. And they are, especially in Inquisition, Dragon Age Inquisition, some characters who are dealing with real life issues. But by doing that, they help some players work through their own problems, because there's like someone in the game they can empathize with and connect with and associate. So I think it really depends on the game and the genre. And again, it has to be rooted in some sort of sense and purpose, how it enhances and makes the experience and the story better. But we are working through this process. We are really guiding and working with the developers in a very customized way, so they understand how to think about this problem, and they don't just say, I actually had that once where they said, okay, we want more diversity, so make one guy black, one guy Asian, one guy is white, and one is a woman. Diversity done. So it just becomes a checkbox, and we're saying that like, would that be rooted in some sort of real life scenario? Like, why are they there? Because if you just do it that way, people will just think, you were just like ticking a box, which then doesn't feel right. It just feels like it feels forced.
Yeah, exactly. That's
yeah.
what I asked for.
Yeah.
We have one question from Ömer. He asks, players said they want to be seen, but a woman named Lindsay Lohan filed a lawsuit claiming that the woman in Rockstar Games GTA 5 poster looked like her. Has EA Games experienced such a case before? If so, how did the case end?
So I think that's a different case where they used someone's likelihood. So essentially, I think there was something in Last of Us as well, where an actress said, you are using my face as a character. I can't remember where that particular case, something like that happened. But essentially, people get inspired by what they see day to day. It's like with music, when you listen to one song and people, that's plagiarism, I think is the right word. So when people get inspired by a song and then someone says, oh, this is my song, I wrote it, but I probably heard it in a tune, it's kind of stuck in the back of my head, and then I'm writing the song and I didn't mean to copy someone else. I can't, to be honest, I can't remember where, I mean, every company probably gets sued every day, and EA is no exception. But I can't remember a specific case where that happened with an EA games that we were accused of plagiarism of a character.
Okay, I think that's all the questions for now. If you want, you can continue on your presentation.
So the inclusion framework. So back in 2017, I think it was a bunch of employees, which mostly started on the FIFA franchise. They were making a game mode called story mode, where they wanted to introduce essentially a short story at the beginning to, and I think it was about a Black kid who's maybe 17 or 18 trying to become a professional footballer. And in the next season, they continued with the story mode, but they wanted to show a female player, and they also had a female manager. And to make sure that they don't show the female as in a stereotypical way. And that was, for example, the female manager. I saw some early pictures where the manager was wearing a suit, she was wearing thick glasses, and she had her hair pulled back, so she was looking like a very strict businesswoman. And they said, you know, she looks like the typical strict businesswoman in a 1980s film. So they just changed her simple things to just like soften that down a bit to ponytail, maybe a polo shirt instead of a suit, and just soften it down from the typical strong, serious businesswoman look. And what they did, they created an employee panel. So essentially, they asked a few female employees in Vancouver, where FIFA is developed, to review the story, review some images, and give some feedback. And that was really the beginning of what we call the inclusion framework. So we wanted to create some guidelines to get developers to think about the topic, how to approach it, and also start creating a knowledge base. So things like retrospectives, case studies, how we have engaged with this topic and what we have done, and compiling research. So when I took over leading this initiative as a volunteer back in 2019, we also said that in order to really drive the change, you need someone to do this full time, and you need some sort of accountability on the game teams. So we continued into iterating on the inclusion framework, building out things like the knowledge base, but we are also working on specific processes throughout the development cycle. So if you look at a normal product cycle, for example, you start with your concept phase, pre-production, production, finaling, live service. And we really discovered the most value is when we are engaging with game teams at concept stage. So when they, for example, think about the story, the setting, the country they want to have it set in, we are already engaging with them to give them some advice of things that they should think about, things that they should research, things that they should do or should not do, that can impact or make it more expensive later on to fix, or maybe even impossible. So that became part of the inclusion framework, essentially, in the work that I do right now. So in terms of case studies, I mentioned a bit FIFA, Mass Effect, and Dragon Age were specific games I worked on. And again, inclusion and diversity is also about giving people options, who they want to be. So there's a lot of effort right now, for example, to look into character creators and give people an option to create their own look instead of just saying, here's a character we want you to play. Mass Effect did a great job with giving you an option to be Shepherd or FemShep, female Shepherd. Assassin's Creed Odyssey, bunch of other games, Valhalla, lots of games give you the option these days to play as either or. And one particular game I was part of, we actually spearhead the process that we are now using across other games as well, was Battlefield 5, the Pacific. And for those who don't know, Battlefield is a first-person shooter. And Battlefield Pacific was an expansion that is set in the Japanese peninsula. And we were, or I was engaged about ensuring that the marketing materials and the trailers they are building are respectful, because the topic can be culturally sensitive. So in case, you know, someone from Japan, for example, sees the trailer, we don't want someone to be upset or insulted by what they see. So there are a few things we did. First, we have so-called employee resource groups, which are essentially communities across EA where people can get together. Like we have one for the female employees, we have one for Black employees, one for Asian and the LGBTQ community as well. So we reached out to the Asian community at EA and said, we are looking for some people who feel qualified to speak about the war in Japan, or at least like look at the content and say if we are showing, for example, sword handling in a respectful way. And we got a few people, a couple of people from Japan, and one woman who also had a master's degree in Korean history. And what they liked in particular about the process was that, and most of those people actually were not developers, they were coming from, for example, finance or HR background. And what they liked is that they were able to contribute through their cultural background, their heritage, or their education to a product at EA, when normally as a finance person, you would not be able to actually impact the product. So they really appreciated to be able to share their culture in the game and bring something from their lived experience to the game, or their ancestors' lived experience. And so what we were doing is showing them, for example, just a storyboard and say, here's what we're thinking of how to shoot the trailer. These are some of the scenes, and then talk the story through with them, and then shape the story in this way. And we were also created what we called an inclusion council for the project, which was the creative director, I was on it, an art director, and a narrative director. And we were reviewing concerns that were coming from the team who was working on it. So to say, there was one, for example, who said, we see a plane that could look like a kamikaze plane. So we had to edit it to make it look like a normal plane or a normal drone. There's also some things you can show, like the rising sun flag, for example. So if anyone saw this, they would raise it through those channels, and we would track it and make sure that any offensive symbols are not in the game by accident, because people sometimes don't know that it's actually not an appropriate symbol in the game, or in the trailer in this case. And so we made some really significant changes, especially how the trailer ends at the end, where essentially both protagonists end, instead of showing that the US side or the Japanese side wins, because we said in war there's really no winner. And by keeping the end open, so that both the Japanese and the American soldier dies at the end, just leaves it to the player fantasy that either side can win. It's a game. It's not, we are not recreating and playing the real war that happened in Battlefield. So I think that was a really nice conclusion to the ending of the trailer. I'm nearing my end, but I also want to show a trailer, so I'll go ahead. So for those of you who may be in a similar position where you are considering more representation or accessibility for your games, a few key takeaways. So essentially, I mentioned that before, the real change starts from the top. So you can do stuff grassroots because you think it's the right thing to do or your players want it. But it always helps to get the buy-in and the support from your business leaders and the people who make the financial decisions as well. So for that, the data that I showed at the beginning is important to show the business opportunity here. Also, by DEI, we mean diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when you have that sort of strategy for from an HR point of view or from a product point of view, connected with the business. And by that, I mean, make sure that in EA's case, for example, this is part of our strategy for EA Studios, that we say we want our games to be less toxic and to be more inclusive, to have more representation, to be more respectful and be more global, globally accessible content. So that when I connect with a game team, essentially they have to listen to me because our CEO says that it's important for our games. And so, yeah, connected back to making sure that the business says it's important for us to open up those markets, for example. Because the people, the developers, and that's what I mean by employees, are actually the ones who are going to implement this. Make sure that you are involving your employees, involving them, listening to their voices, and helping them understand why this is important and how to deal with this subject is super important as well, because they are the ones who will implement. And by the fourth one, I mean, be agile with your goals and approach. Is when I started with this, for example, we started with some basic assumptions and a basic idea how to approach it. But the more I learned about the complexity of this topic, and that there are a lot of intersectionalities, if you remember that iceberg picture, that there's a lot of things that we see, but a lot of things that you don't think about at first, that you need to research, consider, groups and people that you need to involve in the process, so they feel part of the solution, is super important. And if you feel like you're going away and you get new information, you also need to be ready to really change and pivot your direction if necessary. And I know that sometimes it confuses executives because they feel like you're being quiet until your plan is perfect. But I prefer to just go with a half perfect thing and start iterating and testing out my assumptions and then improving the strategy than just like waiting for the perfect moment, because that's when we will fall behind. And that's, I think, if you want to innovate, you just need to sometimes go all in first and just like do the work, but also always be open-minded to learn and iterate on it. So with that, nearing the end, but I want to show a trailer, if I can find the right tab. So this was a trailer that was created by our interns, and it just shows a bit of some of the great examples for our EA games.
We can't see the video. We only see the presentation now.
Oh, okay. Right. Let me stop share and reshare this. Can you see it now?
Yep, we can see the video.
The Empire's time has come. A good feeling. We have a good feeling. A good feeling. I'm going. And everything we've done has led to this. Every driver here is out to crush.
Cool. That's me. So we can open up for Q&A.
Of course, we don't have any questions yet. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A menu. We have roughly 9 to 8 minutes. Okay. Could there be more customization-oriented games in the future? For example, will a player be able to choose their worldview, religion, race, or sexual orientation? So will the NPC that it will encounter be shaped according to these choices?
That's a difficult question. So I mentioned that I worked at BioWare, and we call these things permutations. So it's difficult to test these kind of things because being able to give people different worldviews, background stories like religion, race, sexual orientation, and how NPCs interact with them, that is very complex and costly to do. So actually BioWare started to do less of that because of that. It's just like those type of games really take 6, 7, 8 years to make and release. I think the easiest ones obviously are race, with the, so some things we actually did with the Sims, for example, is where you can, we added a lot more different skin tone options than 5 or 6 options. I think some of them, like your worldview, your religion, sexual orientation, maybe if we think our players want it. But again, I do feel if we are telling a story, it has to be grounded in the game that we are making. So I don't say it's impossible. I just say it's going to be very costly to test it and to develop systems where you can do it. But I don't say it's impossible. It just really depends if our players in the end want something like this. So it will need a bit more research, how customizable they want the worlds and the characters to be.
Are we going to see more like transsexual customization options in the future? Because they are being less and less represented in the game industry recently. I guess only the Cyberpunk put a customization option there, but on the LGBTQI group, they are like invisible most of the time.
Yeah, I want to say yes. So specifically on the things like character creators. So there's a lot more effort to create gender neutral character creators, also from like the voice that you can choose. I think what sometimes makes it difficult is the language part. When it comes to gender neutral language and translations. And I've been talking with people from the localization community about this, so from EA, but also from other companies like Keywords. And what I would like to see is that the localization community gets together and creates common standards, how to translate and make language gender neutral, and some guidelines. I think we are making an effort from an EA point of view, but from a player experience, I think if the translation standards are the same as a localization community, I think it would be a lot better from a player experience point of view, because then it's just like the same whether you're playing an EA game or something else. From what I heard, they want to kick off some discussions maybe in October at some of the localization forums. So that's personally something I would like to see the community get together and create those standards.
Yeah, luckily Turkish is a gender neutral language, so it will be much easier for Turkish localizations if there are any. I guess we are out of questions. There are none appearing on the Q&A menu. So thanks a lot for coming and sharing with us. We hope to see you again.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Have a good Sunday.
Thank you. Bye-bye, you too.